management. Just think how much time you could save if you said what was really in your mind, which is saying sorry. Because we all know when we should be saying sorry, but we don't do it. And that's what festers in us. It takes time, it takes energy. Just wonder what you could do if you came out first of all and looked at what your ego is stopping you doing and how you could have more freedom. This is one of the parts of the conversation that I talk again with Christie Garcia in this next issue of the Spark Rating podcast. There's a whole load of stories to talk about ego here. And we talk again about protector, controller, and complier in terms of how the ego comes out. But we also talk about what can we do when we get really controlled about our ego, so we can just put it out there and be understanding of it. Listen in, and listen also to what it is that you need to be doing to help you manage your ego so you can get the best out of yourself and your team, your family, your children, your friends. Because actually, when we really understand where our ego is really showing up, we can save a whole lot of time, do a whole lot better, and be an all-round better person, whatever that means. Listen in, let me know what you think. As always, it's phil@igniumconsult.com. Drop me your questions, drop me your answers, and also remember to answer the Spotify question at the middle of it if you're listening on Spotify, because there's a really interesting thing you might just want to learn about yourself by listening in. Welcome back to the Spark Ignium podcast. I'm Phil as the host, and today I'm delighted to welcome Christie Garcia back to the show. We often have guests that we resonate with back in to talk further, because we find there's more questions we can ask and also more answers they've got. And often in our podcast, we just don't have time to really do it justice. So Christie kindly agreed to come back on the show to talk more about ego. You remember from previous episodes, Christie is an ego management expert, and she's also a member of the Forbes Council. So actually, when you talk to her, you'll realize she has a lot of in-depth knowledge built up from personal experience. She also runs the Mindful Academy and is building a number of elements around that, including writing a book, which is coming out later this year. So I'm delighted to welcome Christie Garcia back to the Spark Ignium show. Welcome.
Thank you, Phil. I'm so excited to be back. Had such a fun conversation with you the first time.
Thank you. And it's great. And it's interesting, actually, because we've just been doing a whole load of extra marketing around it, because we realize there's so much around this world of ego, and the ego is there. So it's nice to get you back on the show to really answer the questions that we've got. And also, we've talked to a number of other clients, coaches, other people out there to find out what their thoughts are. And really, people want to know, really, what does it mean in practice? So I'd love just to explore some of those avenues with about how do we really manage the ego?
Wonderful.
So you mentioned, let's just start off. You mentioned that in our pre-show chat that you are writing a book about ego. And then we're not going to go into the book specifically at the moment, it's too early. But I'd love you to think about, you mentioned that you've got the ego bit done. And as you said, you do this a lot. So I wonder, could you just give us a flavor of what are the key things that people need to know about ego management that you would put into a book? Because obviously we all hear the word ego, and anyone who's been in psychotherapy, therapy, coaching, mentoring has always got that word ego. And even if you're not in that, we hear the word ego bandied around a lot. But when we talked about ego last time, you had some number of thoughts around how the ego comes out and what we see. So I wonder, where would you start? You're talking about your book, obviously, it's on your mind, but what's the key things that people need to be aware of when they're talking about ego management?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I put a lot of thought into why are we writing a book? And, I think it goes back to normalizing the ego. I think a lot of times we think the ego is bad. We think it, has a stigma. It's usually the loud, arrogant guy or someone that's passive aggressive or, the narcissist in the room. And I look at the ego as our unconscious mindsets, beliefs, behaviors. If you listen to the last podcast, you learned there was 3 ego types. There's the controller, the protector, and the complier. And so this book really is to just help normalize that every single one of us has an ego, whether you're in business, whether you're a parent, whether you are a spouse, whether you're a business partner, or an investor, we all have an ego, and everything we communicate, every behavior we, use, everything that we filter through our system is through the lens of these egos. And so when we can learn about them and understand how they view our world, we can then start to see the difference between perception and reality. And, our perception is not always reality. It might be our own truth at the moment, but when we start to broaden our consciousness and really look at it from a bigger perspective, that perception is not always truth. And so really this book helps us recognize what is our own perception through this ego lens and what is everybody else's perception, whether you're talking about your 2-year-old child or again, your business partner in the boardroom or an investor or whatever. There is a perception that is most likely coming through a different lens than what you're seeing it as, and it can create miscommunication, it can create frustration, anger, all the things.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's been so many books written on the ego over the years, ranging from, the original psychotherapy roots of the ego and the Freudian works. But actually, it's think about this misconceptions about it. And you said about that word miscommunication, because we like to go out into the boardroom, we like to go into our home life, thinking we're managing our ego. But actually, managing your ego is very hard if you're not aware what your ego is doing, or that perception that comes out. And I always think, when you mentioned that, the thing that flashed up in my mind was from my learning from NLP from many years ago was actually about the meaning of your communication is the response you get. And therefore, we cannot not communicate, because everything we're doing communicates something. But
100%.
It really comes out there about, I have an ego that comes out to you. We don't put it out there in a bad way, but it might come across as a miscommunicated way.
Absolutely. I mean, think about how many times you say something, maybe you don't say anything at all, and your body language is just speaking for you, and someone reacts negatively or maybe even over positively. Like, who knows what their response is, but they react to what you say or do. And you're like, wait a second, that doesn't match my intention. That's not what I meant to say or what I meant to do, or that wasn't the response I was expecting, right? That happens all the time. Yeah. And that's pretty much where you can guarantee the egos took over that conversation. The simple things, a complier needs to hear, how does this matter to the people? Or why does this matter to the people? A protector needs to hear, why is this right? What are the facts, the truth, the integrity of the situation? And then the controller wants to hear, how do we finish first? How do we become the best? Why do we need to do this to win? And that, if you're not touching on those, or you're overriding one of those as more important than the other, you're going to get kicked back, and you're going to, not cross paths, or align, I guess is a better word.
And I think that's the biggest thing, isn't it? It's that misalignment between people where they're not getting it. They're hearing one thing, saying another thing. And I should say that mismatch between body language and words, which always comes up. And, Alfred Moravian talked about that many years ago in terms of the mismatch between body language, words, and the tonality. But I think from that perspective, what you're saying there is that the complier, the protector, and controller, they want different things. And therefore, we have to appeal to those things in the way we communicate with people to make that communication land properly. And it's
absolutely. I would ultimately say we all want the same thing. We just use different words to describe what we want, which is what creates the misalignment.
That's interesting, isn't it? Okay.
I mean, if you think about a room of leaders in an organization, they all want to win. They all want to, get more sales. They all want a higher profit. They all want more success. Now, how they define success or what success means to everybody in the room, that's where it's probably slightly different. And making sure that you use those touch points and language so they can hear it.
That's interesting, isn't it? And it's interesting because I often, in my coaching work with clients over the years, have talked about the word context and getting really clear about what's the context. Why are we doing something? Let's all be aligned on whatever that context is. What I'm hearing there is you might have the same context, but you do it in a different way, because we might actually say we might all want to win, whatever win means. As a compiler, I do it one way, but as a controller, you do it another way.
Yes. Absolutely. Which goes back to approach, right? You can't change other people, but you can change your own approach in order to change other people's approach. And that really goes back to if you're trying to approach things from just your own perspective, your own ego's tactic, most likely you're not going to get everybody on the same page. You're going to end up at the finish line by yourself or without some of your team members. When you can change your approach to speak to the different egos in the room, everybody gets to the finish line together. Not saying it's always smooth, not saying there's not conflict or, discussions about it, but everybody can at least have, you open up a new dialogue, a new conversation that's more aligned, more open, more collaborative.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because as you were talking there, the Patrick Lencioni 5 dysfunctions of a team type of model came to mind, which is very much building trust, but he built trust through vulnerability by opening up who you are. And people, if they don't know how you like to be communicated to, they can't adjust their way of doing it. So you only build that trust, because then you can have open conflict, which is in a healthy term, as opposed to an unhealthy.
Yes.
So it's interesting, actually, when we talk about that. Obviously, on a daily basis, our ego is always there. I remember doing a best man speech, and I did this many years ago. And the bride and groom, who are still friends of mine now, 20 plus years later, I started this, and it's interesting. It's embarrassing when I say it, but I said, I could never tell who had the biggest ego, him or her. And I won't say their names now, because the phrase I used is the ego walked into the room before they did.
Oh, I love it.
We are still friends, but it's really interesting, because actually that thing on a daily life, how do you manage that ego on a daily life? That's the impact of it and your responses. So what's your thoughts on that, around how do we manage our own egos daily? How do we do things with it?
Yeah, I think that's that's the key to really feeling the freedom of happiness, is when you can, and you can find that, that term internal peace. Like, what does that really mean? That means you've learned to manage your ego. You've learned the difference between your best self-talk and your worst self-talk. You now know what your motivators are. And so you can sit back, instead of sitting back and dwelling on something you didn't say or you didn't do, you get to say, what do I want to do? What does my best self need to do in order to sleep tonight? Instead of letting the ego say, if you admit that, then you're wrong and you're going to look like a fool. They're going to know that you're an idiot, or you shouldn't be in this role, or you're imposter, whatever your terminology is. But that internal voice that prevents us from just speaking our truth, holding our integrity, showing up as our best self and doing the right thing. And when we can learn to just be okay with our worst self, it's happening. Everybody in your world knows it's happening. Accepting it and owning it. Now you have freedom to just say, hey, yeah, I sucked in that moment and I'm really sorry. Versus acting like it didn't happen, hoping everybody forgets about it, where really everybody's just festering and becoming more resentful. And they'll act like it didn't happen, but it did.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because that thing about that internal voice, I always say we all have that voice on our shoulder, or is it just me? But it's that thing about, we have that voice there that gives us that reprimand and tells us what we should be doing. And it's often, coming back to vulnerability, saying sorry is the hardest thing for a lot of people.
100%.
You have to admit you're wrong. So I wonder, from that perspective, what tips would you give people on just listening to that voice and doing the right thing? And I say the right thing, maybe that's not the right language, but doing the right thing in the way we talk about it now.
I just had a conversation with a client this week about this same exact topic. And I think what happens with apologies, our protector ego, which we all have, we all have all three egos. Again, our motivator determines why we do or we don't do what we do. So a complier wouldn't apologize, because if I say I did something wrong or I, messed up, then they're not going to like me. And they'll be disappointed in me, right? Where a protector is more about, if I say I'm wrong, I really can't be wrong, because if I'm not wrong, then I have no worth or value. I don't deserve this role. No one should listen to me. Like, I'm just not good enough. And then the controller doesn't apologize, because they are so focused on being the best, they just don't screw up. So they just keep moving faster and faster and faster to act like it never happened. And so, when you can understand why you're not apologizing when someone brings it to your attention, that you should, or a lot of times what happens is, we could tell people to apologize all day. It actually has become a kind of internal joke in our home. My husband's a protector and he hated apologizing when we met. And I'm a controller, so I probably over apologize just to check boxes. And so, in our house, now that we have 2 children, it's like, we have to own up when we mess up. We cannot teach them integrity if we don't say sorry when we mess up. And so, over the last year and a half, we've been really good about learning how to speak that truth. And so, I think being able to just stop in our tracks and take that genuine ownership. The only way you can take ownership is through that self-awareness. The only way to have self-awareness is to have your conscious brain in action. And that really takes someone, pointing out the flaws, right? Our weaknesses, our ego's tactics are unconscious. And so unless someone is bringing it to your subconscious awareness or your conscious awareness in real time, 95% of the time, we are unconsciously going through the motions. So if we don't have it in that back of our mind that, okay, in certain situations, I tend to not say sorry, or I start making excuses when I do wrong, or I justify my bad behavior, or I get angry when I do wrong and I start defending myself or picking something else that someone else did to make them wrong too. So now it's not as big of a deal that I was wrong, right?
Yeah.
And we start to justify our behavior through that ego's perspective, instead of just stopping in those moments when you recognize you did wrong and you get to say, hey, I messed up. I can see that I'm shutting you down, or I can see this conversation's going in a different direction. As the leader of the room, I need to take ownership of my part, and I am sorry for being, the jerk, or whatever the terminologies you want to use,
Yeah.
but owning it. And when you can own it, you just gave yourself so much freedom to not worry, to not, judge yourself, to not beat yourself up, to not think, oh my gosh, if I admit this, then I am wrong and everybody will know it. Everybody knew you were wrong anyways. Like, just own it, move on from it. And now you don't have to be feeling that stress, worry, and resentment for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks until you truly forget about it.
And do you know, it's interesting because you and I were talking about this thing about time, and it's really interesting because if I look back, there's so many people I've coached, or even myself, if I'm self-coaching, how much time have I wasted by not owning up to the fact that I was wrong? How many times have I hidden it because I think, no, I'm right? And interestingly, I know you said you're the controller, your husband's protector. I'm the compare in the middle. I'm between the two there. So I think
Yeah.
it's really interesting, if I look back on it about, lose my worth, lose my ability to influence friends, family, colleagues. So from my perspective, you don't want to mess up because you might upset them and then they won't talk to you again. It's that issue that comes up as a young person. And as I say, young person, it doesn't have to be young at all, does it? It can actually
Yeah.
be.
Happens to all of us.
But it is time. So I wonder if you think about people you've worked with or scenarios, what have you seen in the real world that people have had this happen? And you think, hey, look how much time you can save. What have you come across?
Yeah, the ego loves to waste time. It wastes time with things we can't control. It wastes times with things we worry about. And usually it's things, again, we can't control. It wastes time thinking about things we should have done or didn't do. And so, when we learn to recognize that ego's tactic of just spinning in our own head, focusing on things that don't matter, we can then start to really buy back our time. I always tell people, I've had clients buy back 10 hours of their day because they could literally stop worrying about the things that didn't matter, prioritize the things that do, and then micromanage themselves to a point where they're in a new system throughout their day that by the end of the week, they've got 20 hours that they bought back because they were just killing time with stuff that was useless. And I think the easiest way to do that, when you think about it, several clients, if you think about how many things let's just use some examples. So you've got the complier. The complier's in a room, 5 or 6 other leaders on their team. They're having a conversation. The complier sitting there really doesn't like where the conversation going. They don't like the option that's getting put out for their team to implement, and they're really frustrated. But they're sitting back and they're just kind of rolling their eyes and they're just not saying anything, right? And so they agree to disagree and they just move on and say, okay, fine, we'll do it. And we use that word fine because that's a typical complier's, passive approach to saying, fine, I'll do it. I'll go along to get along just because I don't want confrontation. So they walk out of the room and now all of a sudden they're talking, about the head of this project to everybody in the other room. Can you believe he's doing that? He's such a jerk. I can't believe he wants to do this. This is the route we're going to go. I have to implement it and I'm not even on board with it. And they start doing that whole cycle and trying to make this other person wrong, where really they had wisdom to offer and they chose not to give it. So their ego actually went passive and took their control away, took their power away in that moment, right? And so they feel they're having this internal turmoil. Their integrity is making them want to rally the troops to make sure that they are right in that moment, because deep down, they know they gave their power away. And so when we can consciously bring that power back and say, hey, what could you have done differently? What would you wanted to have said in that room? And they can start to recognize that, wow, I could have shared that wisdom, but I didn't want, the ego wants to predict that, oh, well, if I speak up, then they're going to think I'm an idiot. If I speak up, they're going to tell me no anyways. If I speak up, it doesn't really matter. No one listens to me. And so it makes all these reasons of why we don't speak up, but then we leave the room and we can just complain about it.
That's really interesting.
You know,
Wow.
and that is, I think, a pattern that happens very, very often, especially in today's world. I think since 2020, I feel like I've seen more complier egos, especially in younger managers
Wow.
that are showing up in our business because I think they have been trained at a younger age to go along to get along, you know, especially if they're in their mid 20s. In college, they were silenced. Go to your dormitory. If you're sick, do this. And you're just supposed to follow the rules. Don't ask questions or you get in trouble. And so even if they were more of those, you know, controller, protector, ego types, they kind of got forced to be more of a complier. And so now you have leaders in the world who don't know how to share their wisdom, because back then it was like, if you had an opinion that was not going against the, you know, status quo, you were wrong. You were, you know, a bigot. You were putting your family and your friends at risk. You were whatever. And it became a very trained behavior that we're now seeing in the workplace.
Really interesting, isn't it? So just picking on what you said there, you know, a lot of younger leaders coming in with this type of attitude to things, where they've got this complier, they're using the word fine, which we all hear from our children all the time, around, you know, just not owning up to things. But I think it was really interesting about that ego going passive, and then they're sitting back in a meeting and then complaining they didn't have the say later. So it's really interesting about how decisions are getting made, and how, again, how much time is being wasted by people nodding yes, 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 but actually doing nothing to commit later.
Absolutely, because usually what happens in that full process, right? So now the complier went out, complained about it, got everybody rallied up. So they usually find someone that is more of that controller protector that'll finally shoot off an email or finally fight back. So they find their advocate. And now you've got to go back to the meeting and redesign the project or the plan, because now no one's on board again, right? And so that happens all the time in business.
Yeah,
Especially in fast growing or startup environments where, you know, it's like, okay, yeah, let's go out and do this. We got all this energy, all this momentum. You leave and not everybody's on board. And so now you're back in the meeting room to try to redo it again. Where if you can just start to manage those egos with each meeting, really give people permission to speak up, invite everybody to speak up. Unfortunately, just because you invite people does not mean they will, right? And so you really have to get the egos managed for everybody involved, because you can say all day, hey, I want to hear your opinion. If someone thinks their opinion doesn't matter, it doesn't matter how many times you tell them, they're not going to share it, right? And so you have to really help them manage their ego to speak up and really validate their worth and value in that space.
And it's a bit like you said just now, you know, the ego wants to predict. Therefore, if I'm predicting you're not going to value my opinion because that's what's happened in the past, just because you tell me it now, I'm not going to believe it. And therefore, I'm still going to leave my ego, let my ego to control things and leave my opinions out of the table, off the table.
Exactly.
So it's interesting when you talk about that in terms of that people wasting time, and you talk about, you know, the freedom there. So, you know, freedom to be your best self, freedom to be your worst self, freedom to take the stress out, all those things like that. Because actually we're wasting time, but actually we're trapped in some ways. You know, it's when you say freedom, that's because we're free to say things, but actually there's a trap within our inner ego, because we don't allow it to come out in the right way to manage ourselves, because we're fearful of it in some ways.
Absolutely. And we're unconscious of it. You know, remembering the ego is unconscious. We are not aware of what we're doing 95% of the time. Just this morning, I was driving into the office. I drive my kids off at school every day. Today, my husband took them. And there's two roads I can take. I can either go to their school or I can go to my office. I ended up at the school this morning because my unconscious brain just kicked in, and that's what I do every day. And, you know, a lot of us do that every single day, whether we're in conversation, whether we're driving our car, whether we're picking off of a menu. We typically just do what we do, hoping for the best. Very rarely can you stop and say, why did you do that? Right? Or you can even ask someone, what did you just say? How many times do you ask, what did you just say? And you don't even know what you said, because you were just doing what you do, or saying what you say, or sharing your wisdom because that's what your routine is. And, you know, it's like that's how sabotaging the ego is. It's so subtle that it doesn't have to be this massive, arrogant, you know, person on their soapbox. Yes, that's a very obvious ego. We're talking about the very subtle things that every single one of us do, where, you know, someone says something, our feelings get hurt. So we either shut down or we lash out. Or, you know, we we're stressed out. There's so much going on. We're overwhelmed. And so we start over controlling everything because we just can't feel in control of anything. Like those are all ego tactics that show up in every single one of our lives, that play out in our relationships.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about, the name of your academy is Mindful. And I think that the word I'm hearing you talk about, we have to be more mindful of what's going on, because, the reason you drove to the wrong place is because you're not mindful of what you're doing. You're just on autopilot.
Autopilot. Yep.
Our ego is just on, it's the thing that's running us in the background. It's our internal software, effectively, from an engineering perspective. We're just doing stuff and we're not questioning it. And I think one of the things I do a lot of work with clients is around systemic team coaching. So working with the team and sitting on the side of the boardroom, watching and listening, and then calling a timeout during a board meeting and say, hey, did you just notice what you said?
Yes.
Noticing.
I love when that happens.
And it's a bit like calling a team out in a timeout in a sports game, but actually getting the team to say, oh yeah, but doing it in a non-judgmental way, just to get people to notice what they notice. And then ask the question, well, how does that impact you? And how does it impact the other people around the room as well? And that's a really powerful thing. Slows board meetings down initially because you've got to go through the clunkiness of it. But guess what? It speeds things up eventually because people then start to be aware of the impact they have on other people.
The impact, right? Yes. I think that's the key to all of this. When you can manage your own self, you can then intentionally create the impact you want. And sometimes you have to, oh, did my microphone just go off? Sorry.
It's back on again. It came back. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that intentional impact, I think that's when we start to, sorry, some reason everything just started opening on my computer.
It's 9 o'clock.
My computer is very wonky. Hopefully you can delete this. Oh, that's so weird. All the teams are opening up right now.
Oh no, it's probably because it's 9 o'clock. We said we'd finish at 9.
Oh, maybe that's what it is. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to close out that Teams. So yeah, I think this is where the intentional impact is really what we're wanting to create. And when we can manage our ego back, we can start to control how we show up. Now, with that being said, a lot of people think, okay, I manage my ego, then I'll have a good impact every day. That's not true, right? You're just aware of your impact. You're still going to have a miscommunication. You're still going to have an impact that doesn't land how you want because you're dealing with someone else's ego who might not be trained on ego management, right? And so being able to just say in that moment, when you notice that you shut somebody down, I think I just shut you down. Let me rephrase what I just said. Yeah. Right? Instead of just going on with it and continuing with the conversation, knowing you lost that person and they checked out. Yeah. Or like you said, stopping in the room and saying, did you notice your impact right now? Yeah. How does that feel? How did that land for you, Sally? Because I noticed you shut down when he said that. Yeah. And that I think is where you can really start to help people see that self-awareness and see that impact in real time. Then you can manage it as a team.
And I think that's the bit, it's that team method, because just because I understand it doesn't mean that people around me understand it. And therefore I've got to be more cognizant of what I'm doing and my impact I'm having on people. So that intentional impact is what you said. And I love that word about, being intentional about the impact you want to have rather than just being unconscious of it and letting it go.
And that's where you get that mindful choice part of it, right? So you're mindful, you get to be intentional, you get to choose your next action, mindset, and belief when you're conscious. When you are mindful, there is just choice and power, which again gives us freedom. When we have choice and power, we are free to just be ourselves and to show up. The good, bad, and ugly is welcome. It's not judged. It is what it is. And we get to just clean up the mess if there's a mess. We get to pat ourselves on the back if we do well. We just get to be.
Yeah, that's really powerful, isn't it? When you just have that, just be, because then you can have a proper conversation with people to really understand what's going on for you and for them at the time.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Absolutely.
So look, we said we would make this a quick podcast, and yet again, I'm getting away with questions. so we need to try and come to a close in this. And I'm thinking, if we think about these areas of mindful choice, about intentional impact, I think if we come back in time, and we probably asked this question last time, but from what you know now, what do you think you would want to do differently if you were setting up again? Christie Garcia, young girl going into the world. What advice would you give the young person? Because you said, there's lots of young people coming into the business now and into the boardrooms now with that compliance type of intention. What would you to do to modify your own behavior if you could go back in time and just give yourself a mindful choice input? What would it be?
That's such a good question. I think if I could talk to my, younger self, I would just, I'm a controller protector. So not only do I have to be the best, I have to be right. And so back in my 20s, I was very much a maverick. I'll do it my way. I'll do it fast. I'll do it quick. And I don't care if you're on the train or not. I'm going to run you over. So I think for me, it would have been to, this is where I'm thinking about it, I probably wouldn't have listened. But, I think the ultimate thing that would have helped me at that time, because again, our ego gets us the success we have, right? Now, the hurdles and the struggles are part of that ego. The one struggle I think that I ran into probably the most, and it's the joke within my husband and I's relationship, I didn't need no man. I didn't need anybody to take care of me. I can do it all myself. So I was a strong, independent, woman who was determined to have a bank account and have a career and have my own house. And I think there's value in that. So I wouldn't want to take that away from me. And I think if I could tell myself that I didn't have to do it alone, that I could still be independent and still have relationships that were meaningful, that wouldn't have jeopardized my independence or my success, but I could have still had a little more balance. That probably would have been my big advice to myself.
Wow, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I hear that now, and that's a real vulnerable side. At the end of the day, we talk about vulnerability, and I'm just listening to another Brené Brown book, and we talk about vulnerability there. And what I'm hearing there is that vulnerable side of you would accept that, hey, you've got to look at how to do both. Whereas before, what you're doing, the controller protector was pushing things away because you had to do it yourself. But actually, there's a different side of you coming out there that a number of people need to learn. And I think there's a big lesson there for a lot of people. And not just women, men as well, in terms of how we do things, how we go about doing 100%. The best impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does take vulnerability. And that was one of my biggest struggles. I think that's what everybody's struggles are, right? Ego management takes vulnerability. If you're not ready to own your dark side, it's most likely because you're scared of being too vulnerable. I just had that conversation with a client, this week is, well, it's too scary. What if I'm vulnerable and they see through me? Or what if I'm vulnerable and it makes me weak? And it's like, the irony there, vulnerability is actually our biggest strength. It's courageous. You cannot be vulnerable without being brave and courageous. Brené Brown's book, The Power of Vulnerability, it's one of my favorites. It's actually what helped me kind of soften my elbows a little bit. And that's what she talks about, falling in love, starting a business, owning your part, like that is vulnerability at its finest. And it was like in that moment, I was trying to do all those things, find my partner, build my business out. And it just hit so hard as the logical black and white brain who's seen emotions as weak and feelings as not strong, and you keep them hidden. We don't talk about hard things. It was so powerful for me to hear that. Wow, it is. It's a lot easier to walk away and deny feelings and emotions than to face them. And so that's really the most courageous thing you can do, is allow yourself to be vulnerable. But that's also the key to freedom. When you're vulnerable, not just to yourself and everyone else, you just get to be free to being you. And that's when your best self shows up even more.
Well, and that comes back around to that point you raised earlier, doesn't it? Around time, because actually thinking about how much time I've wasted personally by not being vulnerable and not being open and being trying to control things. Interesting. You said you're controller protector. I think I'm probably complier protector. Complier protector. Interesting. I'm thinking about that actually. I don't know whether it's actually controller in the middle there as well. But either way, there's something about trying to control things, about the way I do things. And I think, as a man going up in this world over the last 50 years, there's a lot of pressure on men to do things. Equally, there's a lot of pressure on women. We have that outward pressure, which is about building the ego and doing things the right way and being seen to do the right thing. And as a 20-year-old, it's very tough to manage that if you're just impacted by what's going around you. And I just think, now, if I could go back and give myself that freedom, take the stress and the worry out, change the drama, make things easy, what a wonderful world it could have been.
Yeah, just trusting the process of life. life's going to take you where you want to go. I think that's one of the things about ego, right? It wants us to control things. It wants us to be scared of things. And the reality is life is going to put us where we're supposed to be at the end of the day. So, whether we take 17 wrong turns, that's going to be on us. If we just trust the process, kind of forfeit some of that control, it's going to work out, and it always does.
Yeah.
Even if it's hard, we're all capable of getting through it when we're honest and we allow that truth to be seen versus us deny the truth of the reality.
Wow, love that. So look, we're going to come to an end now, and I asked you before to think about key things you could direct people towards. If there was one book or one resource you could direct people to, what would be that number one thing you'd say? This is where I would go. That's really powerful to help people get some shift in some of their life that helps them run their business better, run their life better, whatever it might be. What would it be?
I think going back to the Brene Brown, I think that's just a life-changing book. You cannot take ownership if you're not willing to be vulnerable. She's got two vulnerability books that I think are written really well. It's good for the black and white brain. It's good for, it's got great examples. You're reading them now. I think just the power of vulnerability. And then I forget what her second one is about vulnerability. Do you know, is that the one you're reading?
Do you know, I don't. So I'm reading Dare to Lead at the moment.
Oh, that's a good one too. I mean, all her books are similar in that she calls herself the shame specialist, so it really does help us drop our guard and see power in that.
I've just had a look on my Amazon channel at the moment. So yeah, Dare to Lead at the moment. But interesting, actually. There's so much in that, and I'm actually listening on to Audible at the moment. But I think when you look at that, the shame specialist is key and interesting. I think when you look at her work in terms of shame, I've never thought that link between shame and ego, actually.
Mm-hmm.
When you're mentioning that connection there, that's just something that's been new for me. And I probably should have thought that before. But there's really a big thing there about, what is it you need to own up for? And
definitely.
So, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Her work actually helped when I was building the egos. I was reading a lot of her books and it was like, oh yeah, that connects. This is crazy. This is why it's doing that. She put so much science behind her stuff. So it was a really fun way to build in more around the depth of the ego's mindset through her work.
Yeah, I love that. No, in that case, I'll reference that. So it sounds like some of those power of vulnerability is one of the key things there. Okay. And look, where would people connect with you? I know we talked before about some of the work you're doing. We talked about the book coming out later. Where can people best connect with you to find out more about this, to help them manage their own ego states and look at how they can save themselves time in the future?
Yeah, thank you for asking. You can find me at mindfulchoiceacademy.com, Christie Garcia. I will be getting my book out and pre-sale starting this summer. So I don't even have a title yet, but it will be here come June. So Mindful Choice Academy, that'll have all the information to join the Leadership Academy. If you're interested in, learning ego management for yourself or for your team, you can also purchase the book come June and get the egos going in your home and in your business.
Yeah, I love that. So look, we maybe need a follow-up later on in the year or next year when you talk about the book, when you've got the title there. But
I would love that.
It's been wonderful again. And again, there's so many questions. We could have taken this in all sorts of directions. So I think there's a number of things I go away with that from that story. So thank you. And thank you for your time again. It's always wonderful to talk to you. And it just helped me resonate in some ways. I learn a lot in this last 40 minutes of conversation about ego and what it does to me. And I think actually wish I could have learned this 25 years ago. It'd been great.
Right? Life would have been so much simpler.
Yeah.
But it all comes in due time. Thank you, Phil. It was really a pleasure to have me on the show again and just to enjoy a conversation with you. I always enjoy them.
Thank you, Christie. Really appreciate it. And be in touch and we'll let you know when the show's going out. So thank you.
Sounds great. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.